The sun in West Texas doesn't just shine, it hammers down on you until your skull feels like a boiling kettle. It was the summer of 1956. I was out there shooting a picture, one of those sweeping, lonely westerns where the landscape does half the acting for you. We were set up near the edge of a god-forsaken little town that was mostly dust, wind, and sun-bleached timber. The heat index was up in the triple digits, and the air felt like the breath of an open furnace. Even the rattlesnakes were staying deep in the shade of the rocks. I've always liked the quiet of the desert between takes. It gives a man a chance to smoke a cigarette without some studio executive breathing down his neck about a shooting schedule, or some production assistant checking his watch every 30 seconds. But that afternoon, the quiet didn't last long. I was leaning against the fender of a Dodge pickup, nursing a lukewarm bottle of Coca-Cola when I saw her. She couldn't have been more than 16, maybe 17. A Mexican shepherd girl, wearing a faded dress and a pair of boots that had seen better decades. She wasn't crying, not exactly, but she had that look in her eyes, the kind of quiet, desperate panic that hits you when the world has just pulled the rug out from under your feet. She was talking to one of our local wranglers, gesturing wildly toward the North Ridge. Her Spanish was fast, frantic, and thick with the dialect of the borderlands. The wrangler was just shaking his head, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt, and looking like he couldn't be bothered with the problems of a local kid. He was a lazy cuss, the kind who'd rather watch a man drown than throw him a rope. I tossed my bottle into the truck bed, where it clattered against the iron, and walked over. "What's the trouble, brother?" I asked. The wrangler sighed, wiping his sweaty brow with a sleeve that smelled of horse sweat and stale grease. "Ah, Bob, it's just some local mess. Girl says two fellas just rode up to her flock, kicked her dog, and took off with her horse. Her only horse." I looked at the girl. Her hands were shaking. In that part of the country, in those days, a horse wasn't just a pet. For a shepherd girl, that animal was her livelihood, her transportation, and her protection in those lonely, desolate hills. Without it, the coyotes would tear her family's future apart piece by piece. Stealing it was a slow-motion death sentence for her livelihood. "Did you see which way they went?" I asked her, keeping my voice low and steady. She didn't speak much English, but she understood the look in my eyes. She pointed toward the jagged breaks of the canyon country, maybe 3 miles north. "Dos hombres," she whispered. "Malo. Muy malo." "Yeah," I mumbled to myself. "They usually are." Into the heat. I didn't think about it much. I didn't call the sheriff because the sheriff in that town was usually asleep or drunk by 3 in the afternoon, and by the time he buckled his gun belt, those boys would be halfway to New Mexico. Besides, I've always had a bit of a mean streak when it came to bullies who preyed on folks who couldn't fight back. I walked over to the horse lines where our stunt stock was tied up. I picked out a big, ugly dun gelding, a horse with no manners but plenty of bottom. He had thick legs and the kind of deep chest that meant he could run all day through the rocks without blowing out. I threw a stock saddle on him, cinched it tight, and slid a Winchester .30-30 carbine into the scabbard. It belonged to the prop department, but it was a real gun, and it was loaded with live brass. I always kept a few real rounds in my trailer for varmints, or worse. I didn't tell the director. I didn't tell the assistant director, who would have had a stroke thinking about insurance. I just swung up into the leather, turned the dun north, and rode straight out of the camp. The heat hit me like a physical wall once I cleared the shadow of the production trucks. The desert was a blinding sheet of white and yellow, broken only by the dark green of mesquite and the sharp, wicked needles of the prickly pear. Every breath felt dry enough to turn my lungs to leather. But tracking wasn't hard. 2 shod horses traveling fast leave a distinct trail in the soft draws, especially when the riders think they've gotten away clean and aren't bothering to cover their sign. They were making straight for the rough country, planning to hide out in the deep shadow of the canyons until dark, no doubt. I kept the dun at a steady, rhythmic trot. You don't gallop a horse in that kind of heat unless you want to kill him under you, and I needed him fresh when I caught up to them. My shirt was soaked through with sweat within 20 minutes, the salt stinging my eyes beneath the brim of my hat. But I just lit another cigarette, let it dangle from my lip, and kept my eyes glued to the dirt. The confrontation. It took me about an hour of steady riding to catch the signs that tell you someone is just ahead. Fresh manure that hadn't dried out yet, a broken branch of greasewood, a faint cloud of dust hanging lazy in the still air up ahead. I pulled the dun into a cautious walk as the trail narrowed into a rocky wash. The walls of the canyon began to rise on either side, red, jagged, and menacing. It was a perfect spot for an ambush, so I reached down and unsnapped the leather retaining strap on the Winchester scabbard. I rounded a sharp, blind bend where the canyon widened into a small, shaded pocket beneath an overhanging ledge. There they were. They had dismounted, letting their horses breathe. There were two of them, just like the girl said. They looked like the kind of human tumbleweeds that drifted from ranch to ranch, doing just enough work to buy a bottle of cheap whiskey before getting run out of town. One was tall and gangly with a greasy straw hat. The other was short, thick-chested, and wore a dirty denim jacket despite the blistering heat. And tied to a scrub oak behind them was a small, neat little buckskin mare with a distinct notched ear, the shepherd girl's horse. They heard the dun's hooves clattering on the rock and turned around fast. When they saw me, they didn't see a Hollywood movie star. They just saw a big, broad-shouldered son of a gun in dusty clothes, looking down at them with a very unfriendly expression. The short one reached instinctively for the old colt riding in a greasy holster at his hip. I didn't give him the chance to find out if he was fast. I slid the Winchester out of the scabbard with one smooth motion and brought it straight to my shoulder. I cocked the lever as it rose, the sharp, mechanical clack-clack of the rifle echoing off the canyon walls. It's a universal language. It means freeze or die. He stopped instantly, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. His partner, the tall one, slowly raised his hands to his shoulder level. I kept the rifle leveled right at the short one's breastbone. I let the silence stretch out for a long, agonizing moment, letting them listen to the sound of their own hearts thumping in the stifling heat. "That's a nice-looking buckskin," I said, my voice barely above a gravelly drawl. "But it don't belong to you." The short one spat on the ground, trying to look tough, but I could see the sweat beads breaking out on his forehead. "We found her wandering," he lied, his voice thin. "Ain't no law against taking a stray." "There is when the stray belongs to a girl back down the road, and there's a fresh boot print on her dog's ribs," I said. "Step away from the horses, both of you. Do it now before I lose my patience." The tall one didn't need to be told twice. He took 3 big steps backward, his hands reaching for the sky. The short one hesitated for a fraction of a second, measuring the distance, calculating his chances against a man with a shouldered-long gun. He looked up into my eyes, and whatever he saw in there made him change his mind real quick. He let his hand drop away from his pistol and stepped back into the dirt. Justice in the dirt. I stayed in the saddle for a minute, keeping the Winchester rock steady with my right hand while I reached down with my left to guide the dun closer. "Take the gun belt off," I told the short one. "Use 2 fingers, drop it in the dirt." He grumbled something but complied, unbuckling the cheap leather. The heavy rig thudded into the dust. "Now you." I nodded to the tall one. He didn't have a pistol, just a wicked-looking hunting knife in a worn sheath. He unbuckled his belt and let it drop beside the pistol. I dismounted then, keeping the rifle trained on them as my boots hit the ground. I walked over, kept my eyes on them, and with a swift kick of my boot, sent their weapons flying down into the deep wash where they wouldn't be easily reached. Then I walked over to the buckskin mare. She was skittish, but she smelled the water on my horse and calmed down a bit when I patted her neck. I untied her lead rope from the scrub oak and looped it securely over the horn of my saddle. I looked back at the 2 of them. They were standing there in the middle of the wash, looking miserable, hot, and thoroughly defeated. The swagger was completely gone. "You boys like to walk?" I asked, pulling a fresh cigarette from my pocket. The tall one blinked. "What?" I walked over to their 2 horses. Without a word, I unbuckled the cinches of their saddles, pulled the heavy leather gear off, and let it drop into the dirt. Then I took my hat off and slapped both horses hard across the flanks. They screamed, kicked up their heels, and bolted down the canyon corridor, heading back toward the open flats. "It's a long walk back to town," I told the 2 outlaws as I struck a match against the rock wall and lit my cigarette. "The sun's going down in a few hours. If I see either of you anywhere near the movie set or anywhere near that sheep flock again, I won't bother bringing a rifle. I'll just handle it with my bare hands, and I promise you that hurts a hell of a lot worse." They didn't say a word. They just stood there in the dust, watching me as I swung my leg back up onto the dun, holding the lead line to the buckskin mare tight in my fist. Return to the set. I rode back a lot slower than I had come. The buckskin followed along nicely, her ears forward, seemingly knowing she was heading back to familiar ground. By the time I pulled back into the production camp, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the vast Texas sky in violent streaks of purple, deep orange, and a dark, bloody red. The crew was already packing up the heavy camera equipment, and the director was standing by the catering truck, looking frantic. When he saw me riding in through the haze of dust, leading the girl's horse behind me, his mouth fell open so wide I thought his jaw would drop into the dirt. The shepherd girl was still there, sitting quietly on an upturned wooden crate by the wrangler's tent. When she saw the distinct buckskin coat of her mare, she stood up so fast she knocked the crate over. She ran forward through the camp and threw her arms around the mare's neck, burying her face in the dusty, sweat-stained mane. She looked up at me, her eyes shining bright in the gathering twilight. She poured out a torrent of rapid-fire Spanish, thanks, blessings, words I didn't fully understand but knew the exact meaning of all the same. I just tipped the brim of my dusty hat to her, slid off the dun, and handed the lead rope to the wrangler who had been so useless earlier. "Keep an eye on her and her stock from now on," I told him, fixing him with a cold look. "Make sure she gets back to her family's camp safe tonight." The wrangler swallowed hard and nodded quickly. "Sure thing, Bob. I'll see to it." The director came scurrying over then, his clipboard clutched to his chest, looking at me like I had completely lost my mind. "Mitchum, where the hell have you been? We lost an hour of prime light. Do you know what this costs the studio?" I pulled a cigarette from my pack, struck a match on my thumbnail, and let the blue smoke drift out into the cool evening air. I looked back over my shoulder at the girl who was now leading her horse away into the dark hills, looking whole again. "Relax, safe guy," I said, patting the director on his shoulder as I walked past him toward my trailer. "We were just doing a little unexpected location scouting, and let me tell you, the scenery out there is beautiful."